Today, I'm delighted to be joined once again by Casey Michel, who is head of the Combating Kleptocracy program at the Human Rights Foundation, focusing on how dictators and autocrats use illicit finance and dirty money to remain in power. He's the author of American Kleptocracy on America's transformation into an offshore haven, and his new book, Foreign Agents, which, of course, I can highly recommend, examines the explosion of foreign lobbying industry in Washington and how that industry has helped entrench dictatorships and upend American foreign policy. And given what's going on in the world, this is extremely timely topic. And I think if you buy this book, which you definitely should do, it will transform your view of how not just politics works, but also foreign policy decisions. Casey, I'm delighted to welcome you back.
Jonathan, thanks so much. I'm very happy to be back with you.
Well, you have a provocative subtitle. Maybe it's not seemingly provocative once people have read the book, but on first glance, it is extraordinary how American lobbyists and lawmakers not just threaten sort of democracy and democratic process in their own country, but around the world. Is this something you felt before you started writing, or did this view emerge during your research process?
That's a great question, Jonathan. This is this is a book that I've really been working on for the better part of a decade. It goes back to my time as a graduate student, a very poor, very exhausted graduate student, focusing on how post-Soviet dictatorships target and manipulate Western audiences. And this was back in the early 2010s. Of course, I never quite expected that to become such a relevant topic in and of itself. But one of the prongs that I focused on in terms of how these post-Soviet dictatorships, including but not limited to places like Russia, one of the prongs that they ended up using and have been using for years is the American foreign lobbying industry. These are Americans, American firms, American figures who freely and oftentimes legally take millions of dollars from dictators around the world to act as their foot soldiers, act as their mouthpieces in Washington and around the country itself. This is now a multi-billion-dollar industry in and of itself, and certainly doesn't work only with Russia, but works with dictatorship after dictatorship. But it was in those early days that I was focusing on the Russias and the Kazakhstans and the Azerbaijans of the world that, yes, I got my first inkling that these Americans, these American PR shops and law firms and consultancies, these were the American networks that were helping entrench these regimes abroad, in Moscow, in Astana, in Baku, and again, in dictatorships around the world. And in the process, uh, demolishing democratic movements wherever they emerge in these autocracies, in these authoritarian states, and in these dictatorships. So that was about 10 years ago. Fast forward to where we are now, to your question is, yes, I certainly think that kind of theory of the case has been confirmed. Of course, I used it as the subtitle of my book. And unfortunately, there are many more examples in the book itself of these Americans freely and legally and in returns for millions upon millions of dollars, far more than I'm unfortunately ever going to make from book sales, helping entrench the most heinous regimes around the planet, and in so doing, undercut or devastate or debilitate democratic movements wherever they find them.
And we have some extraordinarily colorful examples. Of course, Paul Manafort is in the foreign policy space, is certainly one of the most visible there. But we had that extraordinary documentary with Lev Parnas, who seems to be quite a character, obviously in many senses colluding with Moscow, even though he is Ukrainian, a sort of, one could say, a minor gangster. Do you come across these kind of characters? Is this world of lobbyists stuffed with sort of mini mafiosi, or is there a whole spectrum of different skill sets required and different types of character, different gradations, as it were, of lobbyist?
I think one of the most fascinating elements of working in this space is there is really no one kind of typology or paradigm for who a foreign lobbyist is or what makes a foreign lobbyist. I think at the 10,000 foot level, one of the clearest lessons from putting this book together, even putting the first book together as it pertains to how the United States turned into the world's greatest offshore and financial secrecy haven, is that unfortunately, and across the political spectrum in the United States, it seems all too often that individuals or organizations, they can have as many ethics or as much of an ethical backbone as they would like, but at a certain point, it does seem that almost all of them have a price that they are willing to flip into becoming the mouthpieces for the foot soldiers for these regimes. And again, you see this among those certainly in the Republican Party, in modern America, as well as those in the Democratic Party. Across the political spectrum, individuals and organizations do seem to be willing to say, we will go this far in opposing you or opposing a regime or speaking out for democratic benefits or democratic organizations. But if you're willing to meet our price, then we will become your best friends. And we actually saw this especially just a few days ago. Jonathan, I was having another conversation with Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis do feature in the book. They are one of the most prominent examples of using American foreign lobbyists to launder the Saudi regime's image, to access American policymakers, and then to shift American policy itself. And for the last 18 months or 2 years or so, the Saudis have really invested in the world of golf. And I don't know how closely you've been following this, but very basically, they started a rival golf league. And the primary golf league, the PGA Tour, did not like that, did not care for that, and was one of the most outspoken opponents of not only this league, but the Saudi regime itself. And that's all fine and good. They were highlighting the crimes associated with the Saudi regime, the jailing of women for the crimes of, posting on social media or driving. And they were really doing the right things, saying the right things up until very, very recently, really up until a few weeks ago when the Saudis came in and said, okay, fine, you've made your point. How does a $10 billion or $12 billion investment in your tour, in your league sound? And the next thing you know, the PGA Tour clammed up. All of a sudden, the criticisms dropped off. And those who had been, for very real reasons, because their loved ones had died in Saudi Arabia or been killed by Saudi-sponsored terror attacks, were suddenly left in a lurch and realized that the PGA Tour, just like many other Americans, just like many other American organizations, had a price. So all of this is to say, Jonathan, yes, there are absolutely minor mafiosi. Sometimes there are major mafiosi. Sometimes there are those that emerge from the world of organized crime and are now part of the broader American political firmament. Those who are adjacent to it, like Paul Manafort. But you also have the more polished, the more esteemed white shoe law firms, or even politicians that have made their names in the American political space that then leave office and become foreign lobbyists themselves. This is all just a rambling way of saying they come in all stripes, they come in all types, and they certainly make things interesting, if nothing else.
So what percentage, and you probably don't have the figures to hand, what percentage of politicians become lobbyists? What percentage of lobbyists are former politicians?
Yes. An excellent question. We know that there are in the low thousands in terms of registered foreign lobbyists. These are both individuals and firms. We know that at least 100 former members of Congress have left office and become foreign lobbyists. We know even that at least one current member of Congress, now former Senator Bob Menendez, was recently convicted of conspiring to act as a foreign agent. So sometimes these American officials no longer even need to leave office before becoming foreign agents and foreign lobbyists themselves. It's in a certain sense a relatively small percentage. It's certainly not the majority, but I think you should look at the rate of growth, which has been in many ways exponential, of former officials, former members of Congress, former members of cabinet, and of course, even current members of Congress being outed as foreign lobbyists and foreign agents. There's a headline, maybe you saw it in the book, a headline from an article that one of the few wholesale analyses of this. And the headline was something to the effect of, want to become a foreign agent, want to become a foreign lobbyist? The best way to do that, serve in Congress first, which again, I think sums up the kind of ethos and certainly the pattern we have seen emerge in recent years.
I mean, also you could start a right-wing podcast. That seems to be rather a good entry point into that, but that's another topic for another day. And it's interesting, this idea you say of everybody has a price. That might not be said of every industry. Not every nurse has a price. Not every doctor or someone in different professions may do. But what's interesting about this, I think, is that Putin's KGB training would have told him that almost everyone has some kind of leverage or some kind of price. That then seemed to be fully confirmed in his mind by the first decade of the 2000s. And perhaps that's why the invasion of Ukraine and the pushback he's getting from that comes as something as a surprise. It seems to be out of character with that model. or maybe it isn't. What's your view on that?
No, Jonathan, I think you're exactly right. I think Putin was surprised, if not shocked, certainly by the pushback, by the organization, by the unity that the broader West illustrated. And I think much of that shock stemmed from the fact that he had spent years, if not decades, watching the supposed luminaries of the West, titans of business, former leading political figures, statesmen, um, be willing to open their doors time and again to servicing the Kremlin and the Kremlin's allies. The figure that comes to mind most especially is former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, who became the primary and most prominent mouthpiece for the Russians in Europe, and of course grew close to President Putin in the process. But one figure that I write about in the book who hasn't seen nearly enough criticism and isn't remembered nearly enough as someone who opened the doors for not only the Kremlin, but for other similar regimes elsewhere to convince them they can find anyone they need or anything they need in Washington, was the former senator and former Republican candidate for president, Bob Dole, who, Jonathan, you may remember, folks may remember, he ran for president in 1996, ended up losing to Bill Clinton, still remembered as this kind of lion of the Senate, as this figure of a kind of more bipartisan era in Washington before the rancor and partisanship of modern American politics. But what a lot of folks don't remember is that after serving for years, for decades in the American Congress, Bob Dole in the late 1990s, early 2000s left office and became the most prominent former American official at the time to then become a foreign agent. He didn't retire to write his memoirs. He didn't go back to, enjoy his golden years with his family. Instead, he immediately became a foreign lobbyist. Some of the governments he worked with were democratic, places like Kosovo, places like Taiwan. But he also most notoriously worked with a Russian oligarch named Oleg Deripaska, who, again, Jonathan, you're nodding. I think you're familiar with Oleg Deripaska, now sanctioned by the U.S., now sanctioned by the European Union, considered to be for years one of Putin's closest allies, and was attempting to gain a visa, to gain entrance into the United States of America, was having difficulty with the State Department, and ended up hiring none other than Bob Dole to be his man in Washington, to be his mouthpiece, to be his foot soldier, to open the doors for him, and in so doing, open the doors for the Kremlin to expand the Kremlin's influence operations. And of course, at the same time, illustrate to Putin that if someone like Bob Dole can be bought, then frankly, at the end of the day, almost anyone can be bought. Which again leads to the shock that I think Putin felt in the early 2020s when he realized, well, maybe that wasn't quite the case, but who's to say that won't be again in the future?
And that brings me back to that question of skill set, because clearly, whatever skills he's got, Bob Dole's being paid for his network and his understanding of how the machinery of Washington works. Whereas Lev Parnas, at a different level, also being paid for his network. But that's a network of a very different kind at a very different level. Is this primarily what lobbyists are looking for, is access and network? Or are they also potentially looking for skills? Let's say someone who is in the former intelligence services and the ability to understand a whole other type of networking and manipulation. Do we find people from these spheres going into it as well?
Absolutely, we do. Of course, the primary ability, the primary skill set the lobbyists bring, both in the domestic and the foreign lobbying space. And again, when we're talking about foreign lobbyists, we're talking about Americans, primarily American firms and figures working for foreign governments, foreign regimes, foreign oligarchs, so on and so forth. And of course, similar to their domestic counterparts, they know who to contact in Washington to open doors, to affect policy, to ingratiate regimes, to access the highest rungs of American power, which really, at the end of the day, does come down to networking. Who do they know? Who can they target? What offices can they open the doors to? And then, of course, at the end of the day, what kind of policies can they impact or craft on behalf of their foreign benefactors? That's certainly one element of the lobbyists themselves. But as you say, there are a whole other suite of skill set that these foreign lobbyists bring. There are absolutely former members of the American Intelligence Service, former members of the CIA, former members of the FBI who have become foreign agents working on behalf of foreign governments. We saw an indictment just the other day of a former CIA analyst and a woman who became a member of the White House National Security Council, who is now indicted for innocent until proven guilty of, working on behalf of not the Russian government, but an American ally in South Korea. And of course, using her own connections and her own skill sets to benefit her handlers and her benefactors in South Korea. That is absolutely a skill set that these regimes, these oligarchs, these proxies are looking for and have taken full advantage of for years. And of course, it goes back to the reality being that this industry didn't emerge just yesterday or just last year. It first began back in the 1930s. It has a significant pedigree, and has absolutely exploded in the post-Cold War period. And it's only recently that we have begun seeing any kind of enforcement or prosecution surrounding the actual regulations themselves. But of course, these skill sets, the networking, the kind of dark arts associated with intelligence gathering, even things like media manipulation, if not disinformation outright, all of these are services that these foreign lobbyists can provide, will provide, and have found more than enough benefactors around the world to take full advantage of.
So, was there ever a golden age of lobbying? Are we in that now? And like you had the series Mad Men, lionizing those early sort of figures in advertising, are there equivalent sort of, if you're a would-be lobbyist, if that's what you aspire to, are there people you might look up to, sort of icons who crafted the profession?
Well, that's an excellent question, Jonathan. I suppose it's worth going back to the origins of the industry in and of itself. This is one of the primary figures that I write about in the book is a gentleman named Ivy Lee, who, if folks have ever heard of him, he's considered still the father of the public relations industry in the United States as well as globally, and that's certainly his claim to fame. And he was working in the late 19th, early 20th century, doing things like inventing the first press release, creating the first crisis management playbook, and really becoming almost a celebrity unto himself, working with really the who's who of the early 20th century American, both industrial as well as political establishment, working with the Rockefellers, working with Woodrow Wilson, and many more. And he ended up realizing he didn't have to be the father only of the public relations industry. He could also be the father, as I describe him in the book, of the foreign lobbying industry itself. When in the 1920s and the 1930s, he realized he didn't have to service only American clients. He could go to Rome. He could go to Moscow. He could go most notoriously to Berlin and work with Mussolini's regime, work with the Soviets, and work with Hitler and his Nazi regime and teach them how to properly lobby, how to manipulate American media, how to target American audiences to craft the image that those regimes wanted to see crafted, and of course, see the kinds of policies they wanted to see implemented in Washington. Now, at the risk of spoiling a little bit of the book, that ended up falling apart for Mr. Lee, but he is still to this day considered, as far as I can tell, the father of the public relations, as well as the father of the foreign lobbying industry.
And his
Now,
descendants were very active, I think, in the late 90s in Russia when I was there, essentially not laundering necessarily the image of Yeltsin, but making sure that he didn't lose to his rivals, and in some ways thereby one could say almost subverting the nascent democracy, if indeed they had democracy at that point, which is doubtful. But certainly PR and spin put it on a trajectory, which I think leads us to where we are today.
well, you're absolutely right. And there's certainly a counterfactual. If I believe it was Gennady Zyuganov was Yeltsin's opponent in 1996, a hardline Russian nationalist. If he had won, and if these kinds of trends and trajectories and realities of Russian imperialism, Russian revanchism, and restored Russian empire had taken root far earlier or been in evidence far earlier in the 1990s when Russia was far weaker, would we have been able to deter them? Would we have been able to smother them outright rather than waiting for the Putin regime and by the 2000s and 2010s and certainly 2020s been caught flat-footed? But that's a counterfactual I don't know that we'll ever properly answer. But you are exactly right, Jonathan, because Lee's legacy far outpaced and lasted far longer than Lee the man himself. You asked about a golden age of foreign lobbying. I suspect, I would argue even, that the golden age is perhaps the 1990s and the 2000s and the 2010s, the first maybe quarter century of the post-Cold War period. And I say that for a few reasons. Not only was that the real first explosion of the industry in and of itself, when it transformed from a relatively niche industry into the multi-billion-dollar behemoth that it now is, and you had folks like Bob Dole and many others racing to the trough of the foreign lobbying space to make millions of dollars themselves. But because at the end of the day, no one was paying any attention whatsoever, there was no concern about what these lobbying networks, these influence networks were doing, not only in terms of helping entrench these regimes abroad, but also what they were doing in Washington, doing to Americans, doing to American policy. You can count the prosecutions relating to foreign lobbying crimes on one hand in this entire quarter century after the end of the Cold War. And actually, just the other day before we were talking, Jonathan, the one gentleman in the entire 2000s, an entire decade, who was convicted of foreign lobbying crimes on behalf of North Korea, he died just the other day. And again, that's one individual over a span of 10 years. The regulators, the investigators, they just didn't care. And so foreign lobbyists were having an absolute field day up through at least the mid 2010s when we saw the rise of Donald Trump and sudden concern in the United States about what figures like Paul Manafort, who was, of course, Trump's campaign manager, and many more were actually doing. So if there is a future Mad Men centered on the foreign lobbying industry, I suspect it will be 1990s, 2000s through the early 2010s.
So that's interesting because it suggests a certain complacency, a certain hubris, dare I say it, that, Western values have triumphed, the market has triumphed, the Soviet Union is defeated, right? It's full steam ahead with commerce. And certainly in that first decade, despite sort of corruption and nepotism, all these things, it did seem that Russia was focused on economic advantage through lobbying, not I would call that economic advantage through lobbying, not necessarily political advantage. And what we see now, the whitewashing of genocide and imperialism.
No, Jonathan, you're absolutely right. And I think it's worth remembering or reminding ourselves of the broader ethos that emerged after the end of the Cold War and in the post-Cold War period. This notion that market forces will directly lead to democratization. And even if these regimes have not yet transitioned directly into democracies, if we give them time, if we open the avenues for investment, and if we provide the things like the ease of shell company formation, especially anonymously, or the ease of anonymous financial flows elsewhere, as well as the ease of accessing lobbyists and lobbying networks in Washington or in London or in Ottawa or Brussels or elsewhere across the West, those will eventually lead to democratizing forces in Moscow or in Beijing or in Tehran or wherever it may be. This overriding idea that democratic values, democratic forces flow only one way. And it truly was the end of history without realizing that that is not only not true, but in opening the door to these regimes, to these figures, to these forces, we invited the kind of malign influences and malign outcomes that not only entrench the regimes elsewhere, but destabilize democracy at home. And this, again, gets back to one of the core arguments of the book itself, is that these foreign lobbyists are no longer aiding dictatorial anti-democratic forces elsewhere. They have now set their sights on the United States of America itself in entrenching the kinds of authoritarian figures and forces that will enrich the foreign lobbyist networks that much further. And of course, strengthen the kind of authoritarian regimes that would love nothing else than to see the destabilization of American democracy writ large.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because if we look at the economic function of this, and this may be simplistic, essentially, if you're investing in commercial lobbying, you're looking to get some advantage in the market, which I would say is beyond market forces, not the quality of your product, your price, your efficiency of production and distribution, etc. You're looking to gain some kind of unfair advantage. If we and potentially increase monopolistic power, oligarchic power, as opposed to free market forces and a level playing field, isn't the risk also that if you apply this to political sphere, it does the same thing. It erodes the marketplace of politics, the pluracy, to the point where we have let's say, an oligarchic slide.
Yeah, no, that's precisely what it does. It is of course, entrenchment of the regimes themselves, but the increased consolidation of power in a figure or in a small circle that only accelerates year in and year out. And it is not only a manipulation of the markets themselves, but a manipulation of the political space. And it is no surprise whatsoever that it is in regime after regime, dictatorship after dictatorship, that we see similar forces at play: the consolidation of power, the consolidation of wealth. You can't have one without the other in modern dictatorship. Spiraling wealth inequality, and of course, the destruction of anything like a free and fair and open marketplace in and of itself, which of course is in many ways, complete inverse, complete flip of what the ethos in the 1990s and the 2000s was, and it puts a lie, frankly, to what that ethos indicated in and of itself. And I don't want to hop on my high horse terribly much. Hindsight is 2020. I understand the rationale for why those political figures and forces emerged, or why they thought such an ethos would prove effective. But clearly, it has failed. Clearly, it has proven otherwise, and clearly, it has only led directly to the strengthening of dictatorial regimes and forces, to the detriment of the rest of us.
And we discussed in the last episode, propaganda and some of its mechanics. Um, and of course, if you're a propagandist looking to propel your message, inject it into the bloodstream of another body politic, as it were, you're not simply going to rely on, one syringe or one method of delivery. You're going to try multiple ones, the same way as a marketeer will advertise on multiple platforms using multiple messages, because they're going to help amplify each other, but you also don't know which one's going to be successful. So if we take lobbying laws, are they looking at this problem holistically, or are they looking at it in a sort of siloed sense, which means that those investing in manipulating the message will always be ahead, will always have the advantage?
Well, I would say, for context's sake, up until very recently, they weren't looking in the first place. They were asleep at the wheel. They were failing to prosecute even the most basic of crimes. And to the limited credit of those who were supposed to be charged with overseeing these foreign lobbying laws in the Department of Justice, it's not like there was any political pressure, let alone public pressure, for them to pay any attention to them. So in that sense, I don't begrudge them for, again, being asleep at the wheel. It's only in very recent history that we have begun seeing indictments, we have begun seeing prosecutions, we've begun seeing convictions in this space. I certainly think things are too siloed right now. I certainly think things are too limited. I certainly think things are even underfunded or under-resourced in terms of those in the American Department of Justice tasked with overseeing foreign lobbying laws and regulations. But I will say it has been, I suppose, pleasantly surprising in recent weeks to see not only the sheer number of indictments we have seen in the foreign lobbying space, and again, these are members of Congress, these are members of former members of the CIA, these are even members of state level governments in the United States. The former top aide to the New York governor was recently indicted for acting as an agent of the Chinese government. But as you mentioned a few moments ago as well, Jonathan, we saw the recent indictments of a pair of Russian nationals for secretly bankrolling, I suppose you could call them conservative influencers, YouTubers and podcasters who just so happen to be regurgitating Russian talking points day in, day out, not least about Ukraine. Um, Never bothering to ask anyone about where their funding was coming from, the $10 million bankrolling them was coming from. They're far more detailed in the indictment in and of itself. But what we saw there was the overlapping of, or extension of, the foreign lobbying industry, foreign lobbying concerns, and foreign lobbying indictments directly into the disinformation and misinformation space. So even though you may approach these as technically siloed topics themselves, they are two legs of the same stool, right? You could use the third leg of the stool being money laundering operations writ large, of course, which the United States is often at the center of. But again, they're not necessarily separate stools themselves. They bleed into one another. They influence one another. They overlap with one another because, as you mentioned a moment ago, Jonathan, these regimes are simply looking to see what is effective, simply looking to see what sticks, simply looking to see what works. Sometimes it's the lobbying efforts. Sometimes it's the disinformation efforts. Sometimes it's the hacking efforts. Sometimes it's just the money laundering efforts. But they have all of these tools that we have freely provided for years, that we're only just now waking up to the devastating effect they have had.
And of course, the news cycle moves very, very rapidly. So, in some senses, time can also whitewash reputation. But if you are paying for lobbying, you're clearly looking to accelerate that process and hide, in some instances, information. So, what are the kind of main techniques that a lobbyist might employ to, let's say, launder the reputation of a murderous regime? Such as the Saudis, who, if I recall correctly, at their behest had a correspondent kidnapped, tortured, and murdered on the territory of one of their embassies.
Not just murdered, dismembered as well, right? It doesn't get much more heinous than that. There's again a whole range of services that these lobbyists provide. Sticking with the Saudis, one area that they've been extremely, you could say, innovative within is something we talked about a moment ago, and that's investments in the sport space, the professional sports space. It's not limited just to golf, but they have extended into tennis, into football or soccer, as we Americans call it, into boxing, with potential other areas, other avenues moving forward to try to transform the regime from one that was, again, even just a few years ago, viewed as a murderous, despotic, tyrannical monarchy into one that is not only reformist in nature and not only welcoming of other visitors and especially Westerners, but one that can and has become a home for much of international sport, which, could make a book topic in and of itself. Perhaps not for me, perhaps for someone else moving forward. But again, that's just one space, one offshoot in terms of what these foreign lobbyists are advising of. And again, I mentioned that because just a few months ago, there was a congressional hearing in the United States about what not traditional lobbying firms were doing, but what some of the leading consulting firms in the United States, Boston Consulting Group, McKinsey, Teneo, these are the kind of the who's who of the American consulting space, what they were doing to advise the Saudis in terms of these sports investments. And what was most fascinating about that is that most, if not all of them, refused to comply with congressional subpoenas to disclose, to divulge what they were doing for the Saudi regime. And their argument being that they couldn't comply because their partners on the ground in Saudi, their employees on the ground in Saudi, were at risk of imprisonment if they complied with American congressional subpoenas to disclose what they were doing on behalf of the Saudi regime, which was the first time I have ever seen that and that level of leverage that these regimes now have over these American foreign lobbies. And again, this is one country working in one space. There's a story that I share in the book of another country similarly bloody minded. I don't know if they've ever dismembered any journalists, but they've certainly targeted plenty of journalists, plenty of ethnic, plenty of religious, plenty of sexual minorities around the country, and have entrenched a decades-long hereditary dictatorship, and that is the government in the country of Azerbaijan, a now close Russian partner in the region, that in the 2010s was at the center of the biggest foreign lobbying scandal in the United States. And that was when they flew, secretly paying to fly, to host about a dozen members of Congress, many more members of staff, wine and dine them, put up these lavish feasts for members of Congress, provide them these lavish gifts, these $1,000 rugs and crystal tea sets. And even if I remember correctly, DVDs about how wonderful the country's dictator was and remains, all of it for the sake of laundering the image of this regime, and improving the image of the regime for those in Congress, those in Washington. Now, this ended up blowing up again into a massive scandal when it was revealed that it wasn't bankrolled by the supposed nonprofits in the United States, but secretly by the regime in Azerbaijan itself. That's a story with far more details in the book itself. But again, that's just one country working in one space to launder its image. You can go across the board using other nonprofits, using high-level donations to think tanks and universities, of course, hiring former members of Congress, organizing media campaigns, launching their own media networks themselves. I mean, the list goes on and on and on for what these foreign lobbyists do and what they have done for years. And again, how successful they have been at the end of the day.
And of course, it's tough enough in the political sphere trying to get the transparency and probity that's required. Ironically, I'm getting the impression that it's even tougher in think tanks and universities because They get very, very prickly, don't they, when asked questions about where the funding comes from and how that might influence the kind of papers that are commissioned and points of view that are given out. It's, to use the American phrase, protected speech. How dare you question our privilege?
I think prickly is a generous description of how these industries have responded to, again, even the basic request for transparency, even basic due diligence concerns. You mentioned think tanks and universities. I'll take the second one first because universities, like foreign lobbyists more generally, do have basic legal requirements. Foreign lobbyists do have to disclose legally what they are doing, who they are doing it for, how much money they are making. And American universities, for decades, since at least the 1980s, have been required to disclose significant gifts that they receive from foreign governments, especially foreign dictatorships. But for decades, they didn't bother to go through even the basic disclosures, the basic follow through of what those regulations actually required of them. And it wasn't until the late 2010s when the Department of Education launched its very first investigation into American universities and how much money they were taking in from foreign regimes, especially foreign dictatorships. And then beyond that, what they were doing, what kind of doors they were opening, what kind of access they were providing to academics, to students, to researchers, or even to proprietary research itself. The investigation itself focused only on a small number of universities. Of course, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of universities in the United States. And what they found was frankly staggering. They found among even the small number of universities, $6.5 billion in foreign funding that was supposed to have been disclosed to the federal government and then beyond that to the American public, but was not disclosed. And again, this isn't coming from Canada or the United Kingdom or Ireland. This is coming from China. This is coming from Saudi Arabia. This is coming from Russia. This is coming from the United Arab Emirates. Dictatorship after dictatorship after dictatorship. Now, that was, again, long overdue, and we have seen some level of compliance since, but there needs to be far more transparency in the university sector. For think tanks, there is absolutely nothing that they need to disclose legally or otherwise about the money they are taking in, the money they are accepting from, again, not democratic partners of the United States of America, but even anti-American regimes around the world. We know that think tanks have taken in millions of dollars. This is only from voluntary disclosures from a few think tanks. We have no idea how big the scope, we have no idea how big the scale is, let alone what kind of oligarchic proxies are involved. I'm reminded, Jonathan, of the fact that the Council on Foreign Relations, which is one of the, frankly, most esteemed think tanks in the United States of America, had for years after the 2014 initial invasion of Ukraine, had for years the wealthiest Russian oligarch, Vladimir Potanin, on its board of directors, up through even after the expanded invasion in 2022. It wasn't until, I think, March of 2022 that he finally resigned his position. And again, if you think about the kind of access that not only provides the Kremlin, but the kind of signal that it sends, that if the wealthiest Russian oligarch, a man we know is close to the Kremlin, can sit on the board of directors of one of the most prominent foreign policy think tanks in the United States 20 plus years into Putin's reign, what other doors can be opened in Washington? So again, the book has far more details on this, but at the end of the day, think tanks don't have to disclose anything.
And if I was one of these oligarchs or the government behind them, I'd expect some kind of return on investment. It may not be as clear as, say, a classic marketing campaign, but you know what you want to get out of it. Do we have a sense of what the bulk of those interests are? Is it commercial, private interest? Is it state commercial, foreign policy? How does the whole sort of landscape of ROI sort of split up?
Well, it's an excellent question, and it runs the spectrum, both in terms of the scope and the scale, but also the particulars in terms of which regime is behind which network. I think at the most macro level, it is things like economic aid, it is things like military aid, and it is things like investment in and of itself in the regime, in the country, or in the oligarchic proxies network. There's a researcher that I cite in the book who's conducted one of the kind of few big data analyses of these lobbying networks. And what he discovered was that every country that has lobbied in the United States for economic aid. And again, this is American taxpayer dollars. Every country, every regime that has lobbied for economic aid has received it. Almost every country that has lobbied for military aid, regardless of how authoritarian they are, regardless of how and when they may use that military aid against domestic populations, to say nothing of aggression abroad. Almost every country that has lobbied for military aid in the United States of America has received it. So this again points to the kind of ROI, the kind of success that these foreign lobbying networks have seen time in and time out. Now, if you want to drill down to more particulars, the more kind of localized levels, you can look at specific regimes, specific countries, and specific outcomes themselves. So take, for instance, the government in Turkey, which is one of the most prolific spenders in the foreign lobbying space, but also one of the kind of innovators as well in the foreign lobbying space in terms of who they have targeted. There was an article actually just today in the New York Times about how the Turkish government targeted not federal legislators in Washington, but the mayor of New York City, of course, the biggest American city, but still a municipal level official. And in the process, he ended up greenlighting what was the biggest, what remains to this day, the biggest Turkish consulate in the world. So that gets on not only the kind of image laundering, reputation laundering that these regimes look for, but the kind of outcomes that regimes specifically want to see in terms of things that will help entrench them that much further. But what the Turkish government lobbied at the federal level for years and succeeded for years was to encourage American politicians not to formally recognize the genocide of Armenians and the collapsing Ottoman Empire as genocide. And they succeeded for decades. It wasn't until just the last few years that the American government finally recognized that as a genocide in and of itself. Or take the Egyptian government, which was behind the lobbying network connected to now resigned and now former Senator Bob Menendez. They were looking for help in editing talking points that they could disseminate. They were looking for someone who could secretly lobby other members of Congress. And they were looking for insight into how actual votes on the floor of Congress are going to go about military aid and other things. Again, these are particular case studies, particular country by country studies. But if we bring things back to Russia, of course, it's everything from the American policy vis-a-vis Ukraine to the lifting of specific sanctions, of targeted sanctions against specific individuals or specific organizations. Again, even in that one country, it runs the gamut for what they want to see, for what they have seen, and for what they continue to push for.
And if we look at both source and target, is it the case that the bulk of this effort is focused on US and US policy? Because certainly the propaganda budgets, judging by the DOJ list, which doesn't give details, but essentially the bulk of the money goes toward targeting the US. And is the bulk of the source money from dictatorships and authoritarian and hybrid regimes?
It's an excellent question, Jonathan. It's one I don't have a firm answer to. Of course, as you can tell from my thick American accent, I am an American. As you can tell by the topic of the book, I have focused most especially on the American foreign lobbying industry. But that is for one overarching reason. That is because, and this is something we haven't talked about much today, the one key piece of regulation surrounding foreign lobbying in the US is called the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And that does something I mentioned a moment ago. That requires foreign lobbyists to disclose to the Department of Justice, and then beyond that, the American populace, what they are doing and who they are doing it for and how much money they are making. Now, again, this wasn't enforced for decades. It's only begun being enforced in recent years. But even though it wasn't enforced for decades, we still had some insight into what these lobbying networks were doing and who they were targeting and the kinds of means and methods they were using along the way, as well as, of course, the kind of regimes that were involved. It is, in the global context, at least in the kind of broader democratic world, it is an unprecedented insight into what these regimes are doing in the United States of America, in this one country. And I say unprecedented because if you cast across almost the entirety of the democratic space, from Japan and South Korea all the way over to the eastern reaches of the European Union, all the way into Ukraine itself, there is, as far as I am aware, only one other democratic country that has anything like this, and that is Australia. And that only went online just a few years ago. The United Kingdom still does not have something like the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Canada still does not have it. New Zealand still does not have it. The European Union still does not have it. So what I'm saying is, I suspect the United States of America, simply again by the dint of its size, by the magnitude of interests that are focused on America and American policy, I suspect we are seeing more money flowing in for this, more effort flowing in the United States. But I don't know that for a fact because we do not have similar insight into the Canadas, into the UKs, into the EUs of the world. And until we do, we won't have a firm answer on that. Now, the United Kingdom should have its own version of the Foreign Agents Registration Act coming online ideally soon. We don't know quite when. The Canadians are discussing it. The European Union has unfortunately slow walked this, if not stalled it entirely. It's still not where we need to be. And until we get there, we won't know for sure whether or not it is the United States at the top of this mountain, or if others have joined us on this summit.
I suspect they're not immune from it. That's a fair suspicion because is also the case, and this might be a gross simplification, but it seems that there's a sort of toxic triangle here, which is that those who are heavily investing in this have a weighting towards their economy being dependent on extractive industries rather than value added industries, which perhaps makes the propensity to be an autocracy higher. But to keep that going, they need to export those values. They need to whitewash their economy. They need to make sure that there isn't legislation introduced that makes extractive industries less popular or put a burden of additional cost on them. Is that kind of simplistic, or do we see the weighting towards that sort of toxic triangle that I described?
No, I think you're absolutely right, Jonathan. And of course, that bleeds into literature around things like the resource curse and rentier states. And for every example of places like Norway or even Trinidad of an extractive state reliant on fossil fuels, you have a dozen other examples of the Russias and the Kazakhstans and the Azerbaijans of the world that are reliant on their extractive sectors to not only propel their economies, and of course, entrench those regimes. And I do not think there's any surprise that it is those rentier states, it is those dictatorships where the populations are suffering from the so-called resource curse in the post-Soviet space, in Africa, even in places like Venezuela, that are leading on these influence and infiltration efforts, again, for the express purpose of keeping these regimes in power and using Western networks, using Western resources, using things like the foreign lobbying space, using things like the perfectly freely and legally and available money laundering services to hide their money, hide their wealth, and in the process, launder the images of the regimes that much further and keep those spigots of dirty money flowing that much more. And of course, this is something that it did not emerge yesterday. It's been going on for years and years. And the purpose of my writing this book, the kind of driving rationale I had on my end, is because for as much focus as there has been on things like the resource curse or even on modern kleptocracy and transnational money laundering, it is the foreign lobbying space that has not seen nearly enough scrutiny, not nearly enough attention, and of course, not nearly enough investigation at the end of the day as one of the key prongs that these regimes turn to entrench themselves and remain in power, frankly, in perpetuity, as long as they possibly can. And of course, doing it hand in glove with these American foreign lobbyists on the ground in Washington.
And this may be another question that has no clear answer, but are certain types of political system in the democratic sphere more prone to this sort of lobbying influence? For instance, the sort of classic Anglo-Saxon two-party states, which US and certainly the UK share, or are other forms of democracy equally vulnerable to this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Jonathan. I haven't taken the time on my end to analyze these networks from that vector. I haven't seen any other analysis framing it as such. I would love to see that. My quick gut reaction is no. And I say that because not only have we seen the broad bipartisan nature of this phenomenon in the United States, and of course, the kind of elements propelling the MAGA wing of the Republican Party and Trumpism writ large. Of course, the United States still being a two-party state, we see the evidence of the success of these networks in the United States. But if you can go to a place like Germany, which has a far more fractured and fractious political landscape, obviously a parliamentary approach with any number of parties themselves, we see similar successes among similar similarly inclined parties, whether it's AFD or others. So whether in a presidentially structured political landscapes or a parliamentary structured political landscape, I suspect we won't see much difference. If there is, it's a distinction in degree, not necessarily kind, which is unfortunate in the sense that that would, I suppose, be a relatively easy solution to beating back some of these networks. But I suppose fortunate in the sense that we do need to organize, we do need to learn from one another far more fully in a democratic world if we're ever to implement the kind of successful policy responses that are years overdue.
And we mentioned Saudi, we mentioned Russia, and of course, some of the crimes of these regimes are overt and clear and can be read about. China, however, I'm sure has its own network, its own investment. How does China's investment in lobbying differ, and what are their primary objectives from that?
Well, of course, at the end of the day, the primary objective is the same as all these other regimes. It is the entrenchment in power of the current regime. Now, of course, President Xi himself has other designs like the reunification of Taiwan, the effective elimination of separate identities for Uyghur nationals or Tibetan nationals, so on and so forth. At the macro level, the Chinese laundering, or I should say lobbying networks, are broadly similar to other lobbying networks. It is the hiring of former congressional officials. It is the hiring of white shoe law firms. It is the hiring of prominent consultancies and PR firms. I think one thing that is unique to the Chinese example is, again, not just the scale of the Chinese economy. They have, I suppose you could say, more bottomless wealth to pull from to fund some of these networks than elsewhere. But I mentioned earlier in the conversation an indictment against a not a member of Congress, not a member of the federal government, or not of someone who's based in Washington, but someone who's based in the beautiful city of Albany, New York, which, Jonathan, I don't know if you've ever had a chance to visit. You don't necessarily need to go to, but it is the capital of New York State. And this was the very first time in American history that we have seen an indictment of not a federal level official, but a state level official in the United States of America for acting as an unregistered foreign lobbyist, in this case, for the benefit of the government, the regime in China. And again, this wasn't just some no-name backbencher that folks aren't familiar with. This was the top aide to the sitting governor of one of the most powerful American states, doing everything from crafting policy and crafting speeches to fabricating documents and fabricating signatures, all for the benefit not only of herself and her husband, allegedly, but also for the benefit of the regime in China itself. I suspect this is part of a far broader pattern that we are only just now beginning to learn about and pay attention to. And that is lobbying, not just in Washington, but state capitals, most especially in major American states like New York, Texas, California, and elsewhere. It's top of my mind because I'm working on a story about this right now. But we do know that China has taken a lead in this space. The little we know about these state level efforts, we do know China has taken a lead, most especially in the New Yorks and the Californias of the country. But I suspect there's still far, far more to learn about that.
And it must be impossible to really tell, but what is the influence of all of this lobbying on foreign policy? What is the deformation of what may have been mainstream government policy in the absence of such actions?
Well, of course, at the end of the day, it is the creation of, the propulsion of, and the strengthening of policies that entrench anti-democratic authoritarian regimes around the world, whether it is in places like Hungary and Turkey, in terms of American allies, or whether it's in terms of even American adversaries, in terms of places like Russia or China. It is the acceleration of, and it is the expansion of policies that benefit those regimes, benefit those dictators, benefit those authoritarians, of course, at the expense of democratic movements, and at the end of the day, the expense of the populations in those countries writ large. And I would even go so far as to argue at the expense of even American national security, because we have seen what all of these systems eventually lead to. We have seen what the allowance of these money laundering networks and now these lobbying networks have led to in the entrenchment of a regime in Russia that has destabilized not just Ukraine, but Europe more broadly, and threatens far, far more, far further. And of course, that's not even including potential threats out of places like China. That's not even including the entrenchment of authoritarian regimes in places like the Middle East. And it has been the manipulation of American policy It has been the undercutting of the kind of democratic ethos or supposed democratic realities that are supposed to inform American policymaking. It is the use and abuse of American rights. The right to lobby is a constitutionally protected right in the United States. It is the use and abuse of these constitutionally protected rights, not by other Americans, but by malign foreign actors that benefit those malign foreign actors rather than benefiting Americans themselves. This is a space I would love to see more books, more research, more investigation into. I'm just one man with a computer. But hopefully, this is the first book and many to come about these lobbying networks, because there is far, far more to investigate in terms of the impact and in terms of the policies that we still do not know about.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? We have Oliver Bullough trying to do a sort of similar thing here in the UK with Butler to the World and so on. But it's a very small field of people interested in this, which, given its impact, is extraordinary. The last question here is: if you're a foreign government, you've invested in these networks, you've invested in these assets, whether they be academics, foreign policy experts, lobbyists, whatever it happens to be. Well, you're not just going to roll over and stick your feet in the air when these are challenged. You're going to try and invest to protect your networks. So, what have you uncovered in, say, the use of lawfare by these regimes to try and cover their tracks and protect their investments?
That is an excellent question, and certainly the subject for another book in and of itself. Lawfare, for those again who may not be familiar with it, is just a term meaning the use and abuse of the court system to target those who are investigating you, target those who are opposed to you, target anyone, be they nationals in your country or even Americans or Brits or Canadians, so on and so forth, who may be a threat to your regime itself. I suppose, Jonathan, I should ask you, as a Brit, what the impact of lawfare has been, given again the scope and the scale of lawfare as we've seen in London and elsewhere. As far as I understand, towers above the impact of lawfare in places like the United States or Canada. And again, that is a particular element of the British legal system being open and available to the kind of use and abuse we have seen of pernicious lawsuits, of so-called SLAPP suits, strategic litigation against public participation, which silences investigators, silences journalists, and it can even go so far as to silence investigations themselves. We have. It's funny, we have not yet seen any legal suits from these regimes challenging the kinds of indictments, challenging the kinds of convictions we have seen. At the risk of giving them ideas, I suspect we'll see some of that moving forward, only as a result of the increased convictions themselves. But this has been absolutely part and parcel of the broader kind of suite of services available to these regimes, filing lawsuits against investigators, filing lawsuits, against journalists themselves. I have been fortunate insofar as I have not been the target of these lawsuits as of yet, but I have certainly been threatened by whether it's post-Soviet oligarchs or even those American partners on the ground that now act as the mouthpieces for these regimes. It is never a fun experience to even be threatened with these lawsuits. And I suspect it's not a fun experience to actually be the target of one of these that are filed at the end of the day. But that is a space that deserves far more attention, far more concern, and of course, far more policy response, whether it's in London or Washington or elsewhere, because these regimes, and again, this is pulling very far back, but these regimes are constantly learning from one another and advising one another on best practices as they see it, I suppose worst practices as we see it, on not only the policy loopholes to take advantage of, or the policies themselves to take advantage of, but even those Americans or those Brits or those Europeans on the ground that they know have a price that can be met, that they know are willing to service those regimes come hell or high water, and are willing to succeed for the benefit of those in Moscow, in Beijing, in Tehran, in Caracas, elsewhere, and entrench those regimes and continue this truly horrific network, this macro level network of authoritarianism writ large for years to come.
And unfortunately, these bad actors seem to understand our systems and processes far better than we, the sort of simple voters, do. Hopefully, your book addresses some of that and redresses some of that balance to give people the power of transparency and hopefully motivate some of them to get into the fight to change things. As always, it's absolutely thrilling speaking to you, Casey, and I strongly, strongly recommend people to get this book. I mean, I say that with all the books of everyone who comes on the channel. This one, however, I think is absolutely critical for our democratic health and therefore comes with a triple recommendation.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. Certainly let me second that recommendation, but thank you again for having conversations like this so we can, at the very least, raise awareness and then beyond that, again, implement the kinds of policies that are long overdue to strengthen our democracies and democracy around the world.